Good to have you all back for another episode of Think Ticker-wise Humane Architecture, which happens to be our 195th one. This is volume 3 of our observation of automobiles as to learn something from them for architecture. And we have our panel back, which is us 3 from the filling station at 3 different parts of the world, 3 different climates, 3 different cultures. And it's the 3 of us, me, Martin Despang, back near Munich, Germany. It's you, DeSoto, back in our home, Honolulu, Hawaii. And you, Ron, back in your Long Beach, California. Good to have you guys back. Let's jump right in where we had left. So first slide, and talk a little bit more about the relationship of the exotic as far as your dream, your Bugatti, Ron, and then the Halekulani you designed. And we've seen these pictures before, but I want to make the point that you were talking, this is picture 4 actually here, where you told me once when you were remodeling the Lures house, you basically discovered there was a skylight and you kind of opened that. And this is what we're appreciating now. It's actually the spot where before we even got to know each other, Suzanne lured me into the Halekulani, and basically that was our favorite spot. And later on, we found out why, because you designed it. And the other thing is I want to point out number 5 is this great story you told us in the show we did with you, that in this sort of critical reconstruction kind of attitude, that the stair feels very much like almost it has always been there, but it's actually your imagination. So there's nothing historic about it, but it's your interpretation. So I just want to point out that both the Bugatti and you seem very exotic in their approaches. And you are obviously, although you look the most tanned, and you are the most tanned of us, but you didn't get this tan from Hawaii, at least, and not in your genes either, right? So you're not Hawaiian, but as DeSoto, who is, confirmed that you were acting there in a very Hawaii way. And so in a very tropical, exotic way. And obviously in the other way, a Bugatti is not an American brand. It's actually an Italian brand that, thanks to globalism, we Germans bought it. Belongs to Volkswagen, has been for some years. That's kind of odd. And so far about the kind of the interest and the obsession with the exotic, and in your case of the Halekulani, the tropical exotic. These are the points I wanted to make in addition to what we said last week. How does that sound to you guys?
Sounds good.
Well, I think that what we actually want to talk about, however, is the beauty and the sculpturism of the hood ornament or the radiator cap, as they started out being, because early cars had their radiators right at the very front, and you took off the cap to put the water in the radiator very frequently. Well, those radiator caps turned into a decorative element that became not only artistic, but in some cases, a very expensive addition to the car. And I was just saying before we started, they are very beautiful, but unfortunately, they're extremely dangerous if you happen to run into a pedestrian, or if you're a pedestrian who gets hit by a car with a hood ornament like that, and you get speared by that archer that we see there. But let's not talk about the danger. Let's talk about the beauty and the cars that they come from, and let's let Ron talk about them.
Yeah, the design of those gorgeous sculptural hood ornaments became an art form in itself. And basically, they were located on the most luxurious, most expensive cars of the 1930s. When I look at that Bugatti in that picture in the upper left corner, that looks exotic to me. But I have to admit that as a kid from Illinois, lower middle class, a lot of things look exotic to me. That Bugatti is just one of my favorite stretched out vehicles. But I'm thinking too of just how exotic Hawaii was for me, and why that was something that made me a better designer. Now, on one hand, you might say, well, why would someone from the mainland, a Haole, put together something like the Halekulani Hotel, which has had some success? Well, It's because when I began the design back in California after visiting the site, I tried to remember what was it about that experience that was exotic. And frankly, it was everything. It was the temperature, the water, the sun on my face, the occasional rain that seemed to come up from nowhere, the fragrances, the tropical atmosphere. And in some respects, familiarity could breed contempt when it comes to a local designer. And I don't mean contempt in the worst form, but you can see that a local designer could take some things for granted.
Mhm.
And because I was taking the weather and the experience of Hawaii in the room and all the public spaces at the Halekulani, my naivete was one of the things that was made for the success of the hotel.
I think these are extra
Yeah.
self-observational points, Ron. And
Yep.
let's
And for me, just as you just said, for me, it's just normal and it's not exotic. And that's why we have a different viewpoint.
mhm. We will see more of that actually together in the Primitiva 3 review, which is spearheaded by me and the emerging generation. And we might see that even pushed to the next level because where you are now, Ron, it never gets really cold, but where I am so much. So that probably made us go even, one more step. So be surprised for that tomorrow. So are there any traces of that, back in Hawaii on the vehicular side? Probably, that kind of Bugatti I've never seen in Honolulu, but actually a car from that era is very familiar to me, and that gets us to the next slide. Because in our my most inclusive building, basically the Waikiki Grand, which has everything, as far as the range of things you can get. One of my neighbors, which is Sherry and Dan. Hi, Sherry and Dan. They are from where you are now, your adopted home from California, Ron, and they were the most successful and still are vintage vehicle wedding organizers. And they, similar to you, Ron, when they heard about Hawaii, everyone knows that Hawaii is the prime premier wedding destination location, right? So they put the two together and basically said, "Hey, we're gonna move our business to Hawaii." Well, make a long story short, and Jay has been kind enough to provide pretty much Dan to rant a little bit about that one. And in a nutshell, he got caught up in island isolationism and protectionism because the local competitors didn't let him get any feet on the ground, or I should say rubber on the ground with his car, which is really unfortunate. So his car that you see here is a 1930s Packard, and that beauty is sitting in the basement of our Waikiki Grand. So whenever I'm going in and out on my bicycle, I'm driving by it, right? And here you can see, we talked before that. So you want to take over and tell what one sees, guys?
Okay, so we're looking at the picture of the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, the Royal Hawaiian
Yeah.
Hotel entrance, and the
Uh-huh.
wonderful car.
Yeah.
Well, the Royal Hawaiian Hotel was opened in 1927, and it has this very distinctive porte cochere, which you drive in to get to the hotel. Very typical of a 1920s hotel. Hotels like this were being built in California, Southern California, as well as in Florida at the time that the Royal Hawaiian opened in 1927. And the Royal Hawaiian has this wonderful pink color as well that makes it very distinctive. But because the Royal was open during the time that that Packard was in existence, and because there are these historic photographs of classic cars there, it fits in very beautifully with the setting. And the setting just seems to call for an elegant old car to go with the elegant, now almost 100-year-old building.
Yeah, let me jump in. There's a picture at the upper center that is showing just how formal the experience was when the hotel was fairly new, probably back in the 1920s. There's sort of a doorman opening the door, a beautiful flapper is stepping out. And on the picture on the far right upper, is today, where we find a more informal situation at almost all hotels. Here, two surfers are sort of trudging their way through that same formal space. And frankly, the formality of the Royal Hawaiian was one of the things that made the Halekulani a success. Because if you wanted to sort of leave the formalism behind, the Halekulani was much more informal and didn't have dressed up doormen or the kinds of things you'd find at a fine hotel, maybe even on the East Coast of the United States.
And at the bottom, Sherry and Dan were kind enough to give us a ride in their limousine and drove us. So we did this drive to the Royal Hawaiian, and here you can see us. They even served us champagne in the back. So that was our sort of wedding, so to speak. And so, comparing the architecture, and I want to make, you see our exotic escapism expert Suzanne also on the bottom right. I want to basically give kudos to the extension of the hotel, maybe not so much the building in itself, but the sort of colonnade,
Yes.
which is kind of recalling the kind of the syntax, of the, as you would call it, classical run, certainly, the order of columns and their distance. But then in terms of the making, it's truly contemporary, right? It doesn't try to mimic the old style. It's poured in place concrete, but in such a masterful way, in this sort of soft edge, curvy way, that it's really, really cool and really, really nice sort of evolution, as we like to say, of tradition. And I want to chip in again. We're comparing architecture and automobiles. I want to quote and talk about Dan, who's actually been able, although he's not, as I'm pretty sure he's not trained as a mechanic, but he basically educated himself and trained himself to actually do lots, if not all, the work on his old cars. And there's a Buick, by the way, from the 30s as well in the garage. These are the two he brought over primarily. He's basically able to work on them basically by himself, which gets us to the building, because the building is certainly, as you said, DeSoto, it's sort of an imported style, right? But then is the question, is it invasive? So does it not fit in, or is it exotic? And I would say it's the latter category, because it's very sort of open and very easy breezy, a lot of shading. So the thermal mass that it has, it's built stereotomically, gets decharged pretty much through the breeze. And the openings are kept pretty small. And then there are these awnings over it. So, and this is a pre-air conditioning building, 1927, right? So it had to function like that. It had no choice. So again, there isn't just, this sort of on the surface kind of match between the Packard and the building, but also substantially, as we like to dig deeper, they basically are built to last, right? And they're built well. And so you can maintain them also pretty well, both of them. They're not falling apart. They're sturdy and basically resilient, right?
Yes, and the other thing we can add about the Packard is the reason it's possible for him to fix it is because technologically it's not that advanced. You cannot do the same with a car today, because cars today are so complex and have so many electronic devices in them that it's not something that you can just do on your own, which it was possible to do back in the time that the Packard was new.
Yeah. And so putting ourselves, our mindset into the zeitgeist of the 30s, let's now go to what almost seems from another orbit, right? And let's go to the next slide. Although it's from the same era.
Right.
What is that? What in the world is that?
We're looking at mostly pictures of the Tatra Automobile, but let's go back to the 1920s. When that Packard we just looked at was new and up into the early 30s, there was still no awareness really of aerodynamics and the necessity to make forms more smooth and slippery if you wanted them to move through the air quicker. In the early 1930s, streamlining took hold in Detroit, and cars began to get streamlined, meaning that, again, they were no longer straight up and down, both upright surfaces to be pushed against air, but smoother ones. And the car that you see in the very upper right corner is the first very streamlined American car. That's the Chrysler. There were two of these cars made by the Chrysler Corporation, the Chrysler Airflow and the DeSoto Airflow. And they came on the market in 1934, and they were a sales disaster because they looked too extreme. And it took a few more years before people would begin to accept this look in automobiles. Well, uh, later on, and you next to that picture is a picture of a used car lot in the 1950s. All the cars, American cars, have all become smooth and rounded and bulbous and slippery. But in Czechoslovakia, this aerodynamic streamlining was carried to the extreme with the Tatra automobile. And because it was made in Czechoslovakia, there were not very many ever made, unlike Fords and Chevrolets and Plymouths in the United States. But the Tatra was not only very aerodynamic, but it was very fast. And it was a popular car for German officers to use during World War II when Czechoslovakia had been taken over by the Nazi Germans.
Mm.
And it was so fast that it was known as the Nazi killer because officers were getting these cars and driving them beyond their capabilities and having crashes because they were so much faster than cars that they were normally accustomed to.
Mm. And it was, as you can see in the picture at the bottom, is what, according to our agenda, to either have sort of witnessed what we're talking about, either in best case self-created, that we can build cars, or self-experienced. As this is from a museum in downtown Munich, the Pinakothek der Moderne by architect Stefan Braunfels. And it's about art and sculptures, but they have this sort of mini exhibit about automotives, and they have like two handful of cars selected, and the one we're talking about here is the Tatra. But then you also see two cars at the very left that are very familiar to the two of you, right?
Well, the car on the top is familiar to me because that's a Volkswagen. And the Volkswagen was also designed in the 1930s, and it kept its same design for many, many decades after that. But in its original form, it was actually, as you pointed out, made in a totalitarian country. So it started with a dictatorship, but then it shifted into the period of freedom after World War II, and it became the people's car, the Volkswagen. Well, originally it was called the KDF wagon, and that stands for what, Martin?
Kraft durch Freude, which means in English, DeSoto.
Strength through joy.
Exactly. And that's what this sort of exhibit is depicting, with the flag being discreet enough to not show a swastika or a Nazi symbol, but it's hinting it, right? So that's the
Yes.
museum needs to make these, as you know very well, DeSoto working for one. And the middle row we want to talk about, want to sort of get back to America, because in the 30s, in 39, there was this World Fair where one prime piece was this Futurama, right? Where basically they were sort of depicting this world of the future, both architecturally and in industrial design. And so the gentleman, Ron, you want to talk about the gentleman in the middle with a mustache?
Yeah, Raymond Loewy, perhaps the United States' most famous industrial designer, who put his hand on anything from cars to salt and pepper shakers.
Yeah, and the one what she designed is this train, which is the Sapphire train, which looks very much like a bullet. And then there's this most famous pencil sharpener to the right of him, which in that case, the streamlined form doesn't make the pencil get sharpened faster, but it was just the thing about the time that they basically streamlined everything, even things that didn't really need it. But for
That's
sure, things
exactly
that
right.
moved, that made sense.
Right.
But let's go to the next slide and see something that probably the gentleman in front of the next, on the next slide in front of the car would have wished something would have been more sort of dynamic, but wasn't at that point. So who's that? Ron?
I'll jump in because one of my architectural heroes, and certainly one of the finest architects of the 20th century, was absolutely bedazzled by cars. It was a real love affair. And you're seeing at the bottom, Le Corbusier, who really felt that the automobile was the paradigm of this new modern aesthetic. the machine aesthetic. And he's standing in front of his own car, which happened to be, and here's my fractured French, this was a 1926 Avion Voisin C11 Saloon. Quite a name. But notice it's not particularly streamlined at all at that stage. And yet he found that design to be so compelling in his own mind as a designer that in the upper left corner, he would actually compare the design of automobiles to that of Greek temples. And he believed that both the ancient Greek Parthenon, which is seen as kind of an ultimate expression of antique classic architecture, that it shared with the cars the fact that they both established a consummate design development, and they were, in fact, the very culmination of refinement. Up in the upper, let's see, yes, in the upper right corner is yet another very similar French car that seems to be quite loved by the young flapper who is holding on to it very possessively. We're showing it to contrast that car, again, not streamlining is just beginning to show, but behind it is one of Corbu's very famous multifamily reinforced concrete housing developments. And I think from that, we can go to the next slide.
Well, this embeds your weekly German lesson,
Ah,
Ron, right? So what's that project called?
well, actually, that one is the Wiesenhof exhibition of 1927, which I'll talk a little bit further on later.
Oh, I stole the joke. Okay, sorry. Yeah, let's go to the next slide because, as you said, he was a car lover. So at one point he designed one, right? And explain this to us, Ron.
Yeah, his love for cars went to putting pencil to paper and designing a car. In 1928, he proposed what you see in the top row. This was a brilliant forerunner of what today we would call a subcompact car. It was aerodynamic, had a very efficient rear engine vehicle, and it was called the voiture minimum. It was never manufactured, but if you look at the center pictured left, it does show up as a full-scale mock-up that was used on the cover of the book. And because I've glanced through the book, haven't had a chance to read it yet, I'd really advise people who are interested in why Corbu had a love affair with cars, and especially with the new kind of urban planning that had to accommodate them. It's all very informatively laid out in this book called Corbu. I'm reading it. I can't quite name. It's Corbu and the Automobile, I believe. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Le Corbusier and the Automobile.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. And voiture minimum means this wasn't meant to be luxurious. This one was meant to be, as we started talking, right, the people's cars. And you pointed out that wasn't the Germans can't, credit full or exclusive ownership over that one because Americans, as you just told us before the show, did the same with their Model T.
Right.
And here we go again. The French were, and Le Corbusier having been, French, basically were kind of envisioning the same and saying we don't need these sort of flamboyant bourgeois cars, but we need actually cars for the larger masses of people, right?
Right. And notice that this car doesn't look that dissimilar from the Volkswagen Beetle. It was designed shortly before it, but again, it has some similarities to it.
Exactly. But you were pointing out, Ron, that we see the drawings in the middle of architecture, and he made a direct relationship to architecture because he was naming these sort of case studies after an existing French car manufacturer, right?
But he was saying he loved cars so much that he really thought that architects should look to automobile design, but especially the way that they're manufactured, on which to base modern architectural principles. And I've quoted him as saying that houses must go up all of a piece, made by machine tools in a factory, assembled as Henry Ford assembles cars on moving conveyor belts. So on that picture number 5, he followed those principles in a building system, a modular prefabricated building system that he proposed in 1920. These were some extraordinary 3-story, 4-bedroom homes. And he called the system Citroën, again, because I'm such a car lover, this was after the name of the French Citroën car maker.
And that gets us to the next slide, which is probably the last one we're going to talk about today. But there's a lot to talk about that one because we all have some connection to this specific Citroën, which is the deux chevaux, which means 2 horses. In fact, it had a couple more horsepowers, but not much more. You know the exact size, right?
Yeah, 28 horsepower for the deux chevaux.
There you go. And so we have 2 minutes left. So I let you use the 2 minutes to share or start to scratch the surface of your experiences with the deux chevaux, Ron.
Yeah, I have to thank the deux chevaux for probably the most wonderful summer I ever spent. Between my undergraduate and my graduate year, I was working south of France for an architect, and I was remodeling a French barn to turn it into a school for Spanish farmers to learn how to use John Deere equipment. And John Deere's international headquarters happens to be in my hometown of Moline, Illinois. And on the weekends, I was given a Citroën deux chevaux by my wonderful boss. And I would invariably drive up the 30 miles from Orléans, France to Paris, park my little car in front of the broad steps at the Sorbonne University, get out and announce that anyone who wanted to come with me for a long Saturday spent in the Loire Valley in wineries and checking out some of the chateaus, especially the double spiral staircase that Leonardo built in one of them, should just come along with me. Now, it wasn't my sparkling personality. It was 2 things. First, these postgraduate girls and graduate student girls were bored stiff in doing their thesis projects in the sort of dusty attics of the Sorbonne. And secondly, my deux chevaux was just so damn cute that they couldn't resist jumping inside and becoming my Saturday blind date.
Awesome. Awesome. So how can we top that? And I think we leave it for next week to share with you our angles, which are much less,
Yeah. Exciting,
extravagant, I
romantic,
guess.
funny. Yeah, right. No, not as much.
They're existential or existentialist as in my case. And the 2 of them which we actually see here are actually the ones that for sure we have on the island because we spotted them. There might be more, but we're keeping our eyes out. And so, maybe these are the only 2 ones. And
They could be. They could
we
be.
will give you hints of where they are, but we have to push that to next week because we're at the end of the show. So thank you guys again for another entertaining comparison between 2 A's, automotive and architecture, and more of that next week. And until then, stay especially very mentally mobile. Bye-bye.